Hello, everyone. Welcome to Science Sunday. Happy Easter. Happy spring. Glad to have you here. Welcome to Science Sunday. Thanks for tuning us in on this beautiful Easter Sunday. We thank also the DuPage UU Church for its support of Science Sunday, and that's in line with its UU principles. My understanding of UU faiths leads me to honor the beginning of life that comes this time of year, the resumption of growth at this season. And that has been our emphasis on Science Sunday for many years at this time. We've had fun with it. We've emphasized and talked about the reemergence of endangered species, like the Cahansi spray toad a few years back. We talked about the water cycle one year, zombies another. So we've had a lot of fun on this Sunday of springtime. Welcome back again. We talked about if Jurassic Park could happen, really, and quite a bit more too. But this season I asked Mark Ailes to come and talk about climate change. Not only is our emphasis really on climate change re-energized in our country, maybe even resurrected, you could say, due to our new administration's reopening and our participation and re-involvement with the Paris Climate Accord. But I think there's a growing knowledge that it may be really the only means we as a species can rebuild and refocus our attempts as a human species to protect and save our planet. Very laudable goal and something that I think is near and dear to both Mark and my heart. Mark convinced Dave Gorman and I and another friend to ride our bikes out to Washington, D.C. A couple of springs ago, about a 13-day trip to go out there and lobby people on Capitol Hill about climate change and the emphasis that needs to be taken about it. So it was a very enlightening trip. We met a lot of people on the way, tried to talk about climate change with people, and did our part, Mark more than any of us really, to do things to really emphasize what needs to be done, what the earth needs, and what we can do to help it. So to help bring us up to speed, I think it's a great time to do it. This is a beautiful time of year. And like I say, new horizons opening in the political sense. To bring us up to speed on the topic of climate change, I'd like to turn things over to Mark Ailes. So welcome and thanks so much for coming today. We will have the live stream open. Hopefully I can get to it and answer any questions, but I think Mark's got a full schedule talking about what he's going on here too.
Thank you, Mike. Thank you for inviting me here today. And my talk is going to be in two parts. First part will be about 15 minutes about how I became a climate activist. And the second part will be about what's going on in DC in terms of climate legislation and our opportunities. So I am Mark Ailes. I'm from Citizens Climate Lobby Education, and I'm going to tell you how I became a climate activist. So my story starts in 1979 with where 5 crazy college kids decided they wanted to try and ride their bikes across the country. Without much experience, we took a driveway car out to the West Coast so we could ride the prevailing winds back. It was a trip of extremes of all kinds. In the picture on the left, you see us riding through Devil's Canyon in Oregon. The temperature was 110 degrees. At that temperature, in dry heat, the wind actually hurts when it hits your skin. So I'm hoping we don't experience more of those types of days. And then on the right, we are in Glacier National Park. This is just a beautiful place, and we found beautiful places all over the country as we proceeded on our ride. This is Yellowstone National Park, another beautiful place. We never thought that we would have to preserve those beautiful places as we rode across the country. We not only saw beautiful places, we also met beautiful people all over the country. In this particular case, we were riding our bikes, and it was late in the day, and a storm was coming, and we stopped at a farmer's fruit stand, and they offered to let us spend the night in their living room, and we stayed, and it was just a beautiful experience. And I think it illustrates how people care about their neighbors and care about even strangers if they don't feel threatened.
Where was this at? I'm sorry.
That was in Wisconsin, where we met those people. And I think it's clear that we want the best for our kids and our grandkids. We all do. And sometimes in these divisive times and political bipolarization, we don't remember that everybody wants a good future for their kids and grandkids. So fast forward to a science teacher and tennis coach who didn't always make the connection between climate and what was going on in his everyday life. A quick story, as a tennis coach, you're allowed to talk to your players in between games. And so I called one of the players over to the fence and I said, okay, you need to watch the ball. I was giving her all sorts of great coaching advice. And in a break, she said, Mr. Ailes? And I said, yeah. She said, could you get my inhaler? So I'm trying to teach her how to be a good tennis player, and she's trying to breathe. I didn't really make the connection between the respiratory problems my students were having and the asthma problems and their absences and pollution and air pollution caused by fossil fuels and climate change. I did try to set an example. I rode my bike to work. I recycled. Every Earth Day, we put posters on the walls. But I still didn't make the connection when there were ozone alerts and I couldn't ride my bike, or when my basement got flooded by a devastating storm. I didn't make that connection with the side effects of climate change. So when I retired in 2013 and looking for a new path for my life, I saw a presentation at this very church about Citizens Climate Lobby. And I was like, what? There's really a potential solution? Something that could actually make a difference? Something that would protect low and middle income people? That is fast and effective? I was really intrigued. But I still wondered, what could I do as an individual? Well, this is the famous Margaret Mead quote, "Never doubt that a small group of thoughtful, committed citizens can change the world. In fact, it's the only thing that ever has." So now I'd like to show a 2-minute video about Citizens Climate Lobby. Wow. So now, what is this plan? Well, briefly, we put a fee on carbon at the source. We take that fee, a gradually rising fee, and we give it back to individuals in dividends. This more than covers the cost of increased fuel prices for the bottom 60% of the population, and it incentivizes businesses and individuals to move toward green solutions. So now I'm motivated. So I joined Citizens Climate Lobby, and I learned about the 5 levers of influence that can change or create action for Congress. So one of them you see on the left is a tabling event. That's our grassroots outreach. On the right, you see what I think is going to be a future influencer, putting her hand in a greenhouse simulation device that I built, and that's Grass Tops. We also have our chapter. This is the Naperville chapter meeting on the left, and media outreach. On the right is an article I had published in the Daily Herald. And then lobby meetings. So this is a lobby meeting that I organized with my representative, Sean Casten, there in the top row. I am the Illinois 6th liaison for Citizens Climate Lobby. So, what can we do next? What can I do next? Well, I thought if I rode my bike from Chicago to DC and created some publicity, maybe raised some money for the lobby meeting, as Mike alluded to, that maybe we could get more action. And so I talked Mike and Dave and a friend from Michigan to go with me. So along the way, we saw lots of evidence of climate change. There were flooded farmers' fields, flooded roads, roads that cars could not even get through, but on bicycle, we were still able to get through this particular closed bridge. And as you go along through all the farm fields in the United States, Indiana and Ohio, you wonder, why don't politicians do something to protect this amazing resource? We have to remember that politicians don't make waves. Politicians ride waves. We have to make the waves for them to ride. So along this trip, 40 years after the original trip, we still saw lots of friendly people. People were curious, people were supportive. In this particular case, we stopped for a rest, and this gentleman in the orange shirt, he was driving by in a car, and he pulled over and he said, "Hey, you guys should come on over and have some refreshments." So he talked us into it. It was just a few houses up, and he was curious about why we were riding our bikes to DC. We talked about the bill that we were supporting, and he was intrigued. He was intrigued by the fact that it was something that people get to choose what they want to do with the money that they get from the dividend. So he said he was going to talk to his representative about it. So I thought that was really cool. Well, we made it. We made it to DC. We raised over $5,000 for Citizens Climate Education. We got a nice article in the Daily Herald, and now it's time to lobby. This is in 2019, of course, before the pandemic, but we had hundreds of people from all over the country. We spend 2 days in training. We go to mock lobby meetings. We learn what we're going to say in our appreciation for the representative. We go over our talking points.
Was this the first time you lobbied?
This is not the first time I'd lobbied,
so.
but it's the first time I'd lobbied in DC.
Okay.
And this is our meeting with Senator Duckworth's office that I was fortunate enough to be able to go to. And the reason that representatives and senators meet with us is because they know that we'll be respectful, that we appreciate what their different stresses and pulls, and that we'll give them the information the best we can so that they can ride the wave to climate change action. Of course, everybody wants a better environment and a solution to climate change. They just worried about how it's going to affect them economically as well. So let's take action. So what are our obligations and what are our options? Well, on day one, President Biden rejoined the Paris Agreement. What is the Paris Agreement? Well, the Paris Agreement was adopted in 2015 after 25 years of negotiations by 197 parties. It's a voluntary program where each country pledges reductions in emissions. They call them NDCs, or nationally determined contributions. Every 5 years, progress is reassessed. The goal of net zero by 2040, or probably 2050 for most countries, to limit temperature rise to 1.5 degrees C. The next meeting is in Glasgow, Scotland, November 2021. It was originally scheduled for 2020, but because of the pandemic was postponed. And that meeting is called COP26. It's, I think it's called Countries or Communities of, or it's of the Parties. And it's 26 because it's the 26th meeting they've had since 1994. Amazing how long this has been going on. Well, what's Biden's pledge? Well, Biden pledged zero emissions from electricity sector by 2013. And 2035, thank you. And zero net emissions by 2050. He also has organized a summit just recently for April 22nd and 23rd. He invited 20 world leaders that represent 80% of the world carbon emissions. And it is assumed that that's in preparation for COP26. You might recognize that date, April 22nd. That's Earth Day. And it may just be the day that President Biden announces more plans for climate action. So there's three options, basically, for doing something about climate, or any bill, or any government action, actually. One's called regular order, where the legislation requires 60 votes in the Senate. There's budget reconciliation, and there's executive order. But it seems like it's so hard to get anything done in DC. It's almost like trying to balance 19 nails on the top of one. Let's see if we can do that.
19 nails on the top of one you're going to balance?
Well, we'll see. I don't know. This looks pretty hard.
Mark is well known for his physics demonstrations.
Okay, well, this table's not very low. This would be strong. There's one. That didn't work. Okay.
It's pretty exciting.
It was close. Here, I gotta stick in here. Well, that didn't work, but what if instead of doing it that way, we got all the Democrats together, and we got the Republicans together, and we started to put pressure on them from their constituents. We got maybe young people in the Republican Party that care about climate. About 79% do. That's an amazing number. Young people in the Democratic Party that care about climate. About 79% do. What if we wrote letters to the editor? What if we joined a group that's trying to do something about climate? What if we convinced people to to write postcards to the president or to their legislators. What if we did what if we got the businesses involved and said we wanted them to be part of the solution? Like the Business Roundtable, which has just recently said that they support a carbon tax. What if we did all that?
Hey!
Then we might actually accomplish what we need to accomplish.
Nicely done.
All right. So let's look at these three options. Regular order. Well, the positives for regular order, it's the most durable because it'll be a bipartisan bill. It's much more likely to last court challenges and administrative changes. Less controversial, less likely to be used as a partisan propaganda, and it's President Biden's preferred path. At least that's what he's expressed. But it also, even if you don't get a regular order bill through, if you pursue a regular order bill, you can have discovery. In other words, you can find out what different groups, conservatives and Democrats, will support. Even if they don't end up supporting the bill, you'll find out what parts of the bill they might find attractive. And this could be very advantageous in terms of trying to find certain people to support the bill. And that's where I put neutral earmarks. There's talk that they might return earmarks to legislation, which is where you have a specific part of the bill that attracts a particular congressman because it promises money to something in his district. The minus, of course, is you still need 60 votes in the Senate if we keep the filibuster, which is likely, and we're looking less likely to pass something in the Senate that's divided 50-50. Budget reconciliation. Budget reconciliation is pretty complicated. We know that we need 51 votes in the Senate, and we also know that even a partisan bill is difficult to overturn from a new administration. Just look at the health care bill from the Obama administration. The Republicans really wanted to overturn it and still weren't able to. The minus is you need 51 votes, so you still got to find the 51 votes in the Senate, and it probably means a party line vote, but it doesn't have to mean that. There are conservative and progressives in both parties, and it must be on spending, revenue, or the federal debt limit. So it can't be about anything you want, and if it doesn't fit into one of those three categories, the Senate parliamentarian will nix it. We've already had, you're allowed to do one of those each year, which could theoretically mean you could do one for spending, one for revenue, one for federal debt limit. But usually it's combined into one bill. We've already had one budget reconciliation bill, and that was the bill on the pandemic that we just passed. And that's clearly spending. And I don't know how much of the other two categories it fits. And there is room for another budget reconciliation bill in the next budget. There is a Byrd rule, it's called, that limits extraneous measures in the bill. And that's where it gets complicated about whether it fits the requirements or not. As you saw in the last pandemic bill, that the minimum wage was cut because of this rule. The Byrd rule also says that you can only not match the costs with revenue for 10 years. So that's how Trump got away with his budget cuts, because that's going to sunset in 10 years. Okay, how about this executive order? Well, it's can be signed on day one, and it can go immediately into effect. So that sounds great, and that's something that Biden has done on day one. The minus is, since it's easy to start, it's easy to change by a new administration. It's easy to challenge in court. And most time, it takes study, feedback, revision, and implementation, which means time, months and months, in order to get it into action.
Part of an executive order only applies toward federal offices and people. So an executive order can demonstrate how federal officials are supposed to behave, but you can't have a federal bill that tells business what to do or set up laws as other places do.
Correct. And so the extent of executive order is still hazy, because the Congress has given more and more power to the presidency, and so it's not clear how far you can push that. But you're guaranteed, if you try to push it, that you're going to be challenged in court. And so, for example, right now, there's a bunch of states that have already challenged some of President Biden's executive orders.
For example, an executive order could be set by a president to say that we are going to have a special holiday on a certain day, and all federal offices would then close on those days because that's what the president said. Yet he couldn't have an executive order that tells your business or my business or the car's business down the street that it has to close on that day. That's not acceptable.
I think, yeah, that's right. Okay. So here's that one of the first executive orders that he did on day one about the climate. Said a couple of quotes from it: to listen to the science, to improve public health and protect the environment, immediately commence work to confront the climate crisis. It further directs the heads of all agencies shall immediately review all existing regulations, orders, guidance documents, policies, and other similar agency actions. And it goes on, it's going to look at everything that's been done during the Trump administration and reevaluate it, which is great for the environment. But again, that means they're going to spend time reviewing. They're going to spend time recommending, and then they're going to spend time evaluating those recommendations. So it's going to take time. Further, as Mike pointed out, there's always this little writing in every executive order that I've seen, and maybe it's obvious. It says, as appropriate and consistent with applicable law. But of course, this is where you have the court challenge possibility. If it conflicts with local or state law, or particularly federal law, the argument can be made, then it's going to be challenged in court, or could be anyways. Here's one more example of executive order, and I just wanted to point out that it was 6 Trump executive orders that are being rescinded. It was done on February 24th, and the other 2 dates show the dates, basically, of the Trump administration. So what's going on in the Democratic Party in Congress? Well, it seems that the Democratic Party is divided into basic 3 camps. And they're not mutually exclusive, so they could be in more than one camp at the same time. One is incentives and subsidies. These are the least controversial and are likely to be included in a package. The second is regulations and standards like the Clean Energy Standard. The Clean Energy Standard would require providers to have a % clean energy, or if they can't make that %, to purchase credits from somebody who can do even better than that %. Regulations can mandate efficiency requirements, like like mileage standards for cars. And then the third group is a carbon price. So let's look at regulations versus a carbon price. Regulations are mandated reductions, so you have to do them. And there's nothing wrong with that. That's a perfectly legitimate way to get action on climate. Carbon pricing offers financial incentives. The recent Democratic proposals, one from the Senate Carbon Committee, the Democratic Select House Committee, and Biden's Clean Energy Future Plan, all involve mostly regulations. And like we said, there's nothing wrong with doing regulations. It's an effective way, but you have to pass those regulations, and then it takes time to implement them. So here's a graph I know you can't read, but the point is that this House Select Committee looked at 17 different regulations and did a study to see if they implemented all those regulations, what effect would it have? And if they implemented all those regulations and they maintained them through 2050, it would reduce emissions by 88%, which is good. One of the problems with regulations is their cost. They're not as efficient in terms of economic cost as a carbon price. If you do the clean energy standard just the right way, it could be just as economic as a carbon price. But if you mandate wind and solar, then you're not going to be as efficient. If the efficiency of a carbon price comes from the fact that you say, okay, here's the cost, you in the marketplace figure out how to do this most efficiently. And they're very good at that. The CAFE standards, where you say, okay, every car has to have this mileage, that sort of thing. Those, again, are more expensive. That doesn't mean they're bad. It just means if that's something you're considering, they're more expensive. They're also not progressive. That doesn't mean you can't add a progressive bill to a regulation. You could. But regulations by themselves are not progressive. If you increase the mileage standard for cars, the cars are going to be a little more expensive, and that's certainly not going to help the bottom of our bottom employers of our, or employees, excuse me, of our country.
By progressive, you're basically saying that it's regressive. It costs more to lower income people than it does to higher income people in terms of maybe the percentage of their income or whatever.
Exactly, thank you, yeah. Also, urgency. When you do regulations, it requires rulemaking, and then it could face court challenges, and the court challenges could be successful. So these are all things that make it harder to make regulations work. And then finally, if you pass regulations in a partisan way, you're less likely to have that durable. Okay. So there's many carbon pricing bills that have been introduced in Congress. In the last Congress, there was many. In the current Congress, there's only two, to my knowledge. There was one introduced like 3 days ago, and that's the Energy Innovation and Carbon Dividend Act by Representative Deutsch. And then prior to that, our own Senator Durbin introduced the America's Clean Future Fund Act. So what is a carbon price? I've got a short 4-minute video I'd like to show you now, explaining it better than I.
energy system is leading us toward dangerous risks of climate change, like sea level rise and extreme weather events. Our current policies are nowhere near the long-term targets that we need to hit. A carbon tax is one way to bring down emissions quickly while lowering the cost of moving to a low-carbon economy. Here's how it works. Carbon dioxide is a byproduct of day-to-day activities. Without a carbon tax, we can emit as much carbon dioxide as we like into the atmosphere for free without any consideration of the harm caused by these emissions. A carbon tax changes that by charging a price for every ton of carbon dioxide released into the atmosphere. For example, a power plant that generates electricity to homes and businesses would now pay that price for its carbon dioxide emissions. Now that it is charged for emissions, the power company has an incentive to find ways to reduce its emissions and invest in zero carbon technologies to avoid future carbon taxes. Consumers have an incentive to reduce their electricity use to avoid paying the tax, which is incorporated into their electricity prices. The revenue collected from the carbon tax goes into a pool that can be used for other purposes, like reducing other taxes, investing in clean energy, and simply sending checks to Americans. The result? Emissions go down, and new low-carbon technologies and products are born. Designed right, a carbon tax can help us avoid dangerous impacts of climate change at a much lower cost compared to alternative policy options. But designing a smart carbon tax requires policymakers to make important decisions, such as setting the carbon tax rates at the right level to ensure emissions reductions and minimal effect on energy consumers and on the economy. Choosing which activities that produce emissions to tax and which not to tax. Choosing how to allocate the revenue in a way that benefits the economy and the environment and is fair to all Americans. Deciding which policies are well suited to exist alongside carbon tax and which are not. The Columbia University Center on Global Energy Policy and its partners analyzed a carbon tax policy that would start at $50 per ton of carbon dioxide emissions and increases by 2% annually. Here's what we found. Emissions fall by about 40% below 2005 levels and 25% below where the US is currently on track for in 2030. $180 billion in revenue is generated per year that could be used to reduce payroll taxes by 2 to 3 percentage points, to increase government investments in clean energy transition, or to send every American a check for $1,000 each year, which would be more than enough to compensate average low and middle class households from increased energy prices. The impacts on the overall US economy of the carbon tax should be small, particularly when the revenues the government collects are used productively. A $50 per ton scenario would have a dramatic impact on the climate, but little impact on economic growth. A well-designed carbon tax can help us avoid climate risks and minimize the costs of transitioning to a low-carbon economy. To learn more about carbon taxes, visit Columbia's Center on Global Energy Policy online.
So, here are some of the bills that were introduced in the last Congress. And there is one on there that's been reintroduced. So as you can see, the bills all call for a carbon price that gradually increases through time. The black line is the Deutsch Bill, the Energy Innovation and Carbon Dividend Act. And it has the second most aggressive increase in cost. The green line is the Coons Bill, which is also a very good bill and has even a steeper line. But the Deutsch Bill currently has 28 co-sponsors, and the Coons Bill has not been reintroduced and did not have any coast or many co-sponsors. It might have had one or two. The Durbin bill, which is not on this graph because it's so new, would be parallel to the black line there, just below it, because it has a similar increase in cost, but it doesn't start as soon. The Deutsch bill is going to start in 2022, and the Durbin bill doesn't start until 2023, and that means it's going to start out a little lower. This is the projected energy-related carbon dioxide emissions. Again, you can see that the black line there of the Deutsch bill is got the second most reduction in emissions, and then the green line is the Coons bill. And again, Senator Durbin's bill would be probably just above the black line, with a similar curve. Of course, all of these bills generate revenue, and the ones that have a higher carbon price generate more revenue. Okay, this is interesting because this is a study that's independent of climate advocate groups, and was not commissioned by Citizens Climate Lobby, but it shows on the left graph the projection needed to get to zero emissions by either 2040, the first line, or 2050 or 2060. And it's interesting, if you'll notice, that the lines are solid until about 2030, and then they are dashed the rest of the way. The reason for this is that any modeler will tell you that beyond 10 years, it's almost guesswork to make a really good prediction about what's going to happen. So what they're giving you is the trend line. If the trend line continues, that's where you would end up. So what they did then is they looked at two particular years, 2025 and 2030. And if you look at those 2 years, and then you look at what kind of carbon price you would need to be on track, you can see that the blue box is on track, and the blue box is the Energy Innovation and Carbon Dividend Act is basically right in the middle of that blue box. So it's definitely on track to get to zero emissions by 2050, according to this study. Now this is interesting. With any model, there's uncertainty. And so this is a list of the sources of uncertainty in this particular model. And so they had to, for example, for oil prices, they had to say, well, what do we think oil prices are going to be? And so they picked some point where they thought they'd be. What if they're wrong? What if oil prices are lower than that or higher than that? They had to pick a standard for innovation. And what about complementary policies? What about other policies that are passed? What if there's more of them than we think there are going to be, or fewer? The interesting thing about this uncertainty model is that even with the range that we have, if you look down to the difference that we need in a carbon price, for most of them, it's only just $10 more or $10 less. So you can make adjustments to the carbon price to fit into the uncertainty according to this model. The Energy Innovation and Carbon Dividend Act and Durbin's bill have a yearly adjustment that's allowed. And they go up $10 per ton each year, but if they're not meeting the targets, they can go up 15. They can go up another $5 per ton. And I think Durbin even has a further provision for up to 20. Okay, now one of the things you're going to hear from some groups that don't like carbon prices is that they're going to wreck the economy, that they're going to wreck jobs. Well, this is another independent study that's peer-reviewed, and by Noah Kaufman, and you might recognize that Noah Kaufman is now in the administration. But what he did is he looked at GDP, And so the first black bar there is the GDP on 2016. And then 10 years later, the predicted GDP with current policy is the next bar. And then he looked at different carbon prices with different options for doing something with those carbon prices. So whether and no matter what you do with the money, as far as GDP is concerned, it's very little effect. The second to last bar there is for rebates, for returning the money to the citizens, which is what both Durbin's bill does mostly. 75% goes back, and what the Energy Innovation Carbon Dividend Act does, 100% goes back to individuals. Okay, so, but that, of course, that previous one was based on a model. What about actual data? Well, we have actual data, as it turns out. A carbon tax has been implemented in 31 countries for 30 years. So, this study looked at what kind of effect did that carbon tax have on their GDP. And you can see it has almost no effect. It's maybe a little bit of improvement at first, a little dip after 4 years, and then basically a straight line. But what about not doing anything? What would that do to the GDP? Well, according to this study, co-chaired by Janet Yellen, who you might recognize as our Secretary of the Treasury, the GDP by 2100 could be reduced by 25% worldwide if we don't do anything. And what about the co-benefits of doing something? Well, of course, the climate disasters that we're experiencing are very expensive. And this is for the United States, but this $100 to $300 billion figure from this study is really way underestimated. And there's a new number that's coming out in the spring, which will be dramatically higher. And then the health co-benefits, all the people that are not going to get respiratory diseases and die early because of respiratory problems. So the benefits are conservatively 800 billion to $1 trillion
Per year.
per year. That's right. Well, you're going to destroy jobs with a carbon price, right? That's what the argument's going to be. Well, we have another actual job study in Europe, 31 countries, 30 years. What did the carbon price do to jobs? Basically nothing. They stayed steady. So what are these jobs going to be like? Well, the clean jobs are, by and large, going to be comparable to jobs that are going to be lost. The job growth right now is twice the national average without a carbon price. Wages are 25% higher than the national average, and they're more likely to have health and retirement benefits than the national average, and they're generally comparable to fossil fuel jobs, but not always. Okay, this is my last slide here that I wanted to show you. This is an independent peer-reviewed study that shows what would happen with a carbon tax that was $50 per ton by the year 2025, and what would it do to the different quintiles of our population. And and what they evaluated was their tax burden. And they evaluated it depending on what you did with the revenue. If you gave the money back to everybody, or if you gave a deficit reduction instead of giving it back to people, or you reduced payroll taxes. And you can see the only one that has, oh, that might not bode well.
Worked for quite a while. That was impressive.
And the only one that has a negative impact on tax tax burden is when you give all the money back to the people. And as a matter of fact, the bottom 3 quintiles all get more money back than they will have in increased costs. And the 4th quintile is basically unchanged. Even the highest income quintile receives less than a 1% increase in cost. And so really, it's progressive, a carbon tax in which you give all the money back to the people.
And this money is given back per capita, so a person in the lowest 20%, the lowest quintile would get the same amount of money back that a person in the highest quintile would get back.
Correct.
Not by portion of their income or anything else
Right.
like that.
Right, the dividends would be equal for everyone. And since people in the bottom quintile have generally the smallest carbon footprint, like 97% would get more money back, and 2% would break even. So very few.
Few that are wasteful might find ways to change
It, it could be, there's certain people that just, their circumstances don't fit nicely into that category. What if you're at college and you have, no income, and yet you're using fuel, then it might not, so there's certain people in certain circumstances it might not positively affect. But it'd be very small even if it was negative. Any questions, or we don't have any?
I think, yeah, we've had a nice turnout, somewhere 25 people or so, and I think a lot of people, because of the timing of this being Easter, are probably going to look at this later, too.
Okay, great.
So I was surprised, yeah, I'm not seeing, there's a couple of compliments, and that's about it for right now. No one's confused. I was going to ask if you see a difference. I think for a while, the Citizens Climate Lobby was very careful not to say a carbon tax because of its the negative implications on it. And once something is called a tax, people assume the government got its hands on it, and they aren't going to give any of the money back that they got.
Right.
And so they were making specifically use of the word dividend rather than carbon tax.
Well, right, carbon fee and dividend, right? So we like to call it a fee, but whether it's a fee or a tax, the Constitution obviously gives the government the authority to institute taxes and fees. And so that's one of the great things about it. You could include it in a budget reconciliation bill, and it would be very hard to challenge it in court, because how can you tell the courts that, hey, the government doesn't have the authority to institute a tax? It's right there in the Constitution. So that's one of the benefits of it.
It's a
And
little semantic, whether
Yeah.
you say fee or tax,
Right.
really, huh?
right, and I know there's this fear, well, what if the government doesn't give back the money? Well, it's in the bill. It'll be the law. It's not going to be optional. So assuming the bill passes as we intend, as intended, they won't have a choice.
Some of that always gets you kind of worried, because when they set up the gambling boats in Illinois, right? And it was all going to help education. You remember how much it helped you as a physics teacher,
Yeah.
all the gambling bills that were put in, and the money was all collected, and then it went towards education. The only thing is that they took other money that would have gone to education anyways, and
Right.
did the switcheroo or whatever.
Yeah.
So there are natural reasons of people being concerned about some of these
Oh,
things.
absolutely. And the bill is going to be changed when it goes through all these committees and these negotiations and stuff. So absolutely have to stay on top of it and make sure that it does what's intended. And one more thing, Citizens Climate Lobby advocates for this Energy Innovation and Carbon Dividend Act. We feel that's the best solution. But we are not opposed to other solutions, obviously. Our bottom line is it has to be effective, and it has to protect the bottom 40% of our population in terms of income. If it meets those two criteria, we'll support it.
And I know you've had a lot of talks with Sean Caston and maybe Foster and other representatives in the area. And I know Caston has a pretty long background of working in the energy fields and so on. But he has a little bit different take. He's not looking at it exactly. Can you cover a little bit of what he does differently or thinks differently?
Yeah, Sean Caston is strongly in favor of a carbon price, which got everybody excited. But he really doesn't like fee and dividend. And his argument is that you're not giving the money back to the people that are going to reduce emissions, which, of course, we disagree with. If you give it back to everybody and the costs of fossil fuels go up, people are going to choose to reduce emissions, and particularly businesses, to stay competitive. But his plan is to do a cap and trade type approach, which again is, Citizens Climate Lobby is not opposed to that plan. The cap and trade then would only, however, work in the electricity sector, the energy production sector, and the heat production sector of the economy. And further, he wants to give the money that you get from that to green energy companies to accelerate the movement toward green, which is a great idea from that standpoint.
Innovation and so on.
Right, which is great. The problems, as I see it, is that one, okay, you got to do something else then for the bottom 40%, and two, if you really think that's going to make energy prices lower or stay low, well, then you got the problem of if the price is low, then the consumption is going to go up. So you have to be careful with any plan to make sure it's going to do what's intended.
I thought that a thing that I liked about the fee and dividend plan of the Citizens Climate Lobby seemed to me to be that it reached out to both sides of the aisle. You started talking about being not trying to make enemies and not trying to, own your enemies or whatever, but to try to come together in something. And this is something that once you say everybody's going to get money back, that's a appealing thing to a lot of people. It's one way that Social Security got sold early on, that everyone puts into Social Security and it's not means tested. If you put into Social Security, then you get some money back. And so this is something that I think does try to reach out and blend this topic. Maybe you can talk about that further.
Yeah, you're right. That's a good point. And Citizens Climate Lobby has definitely not given up on bipartisanship. And we still have, I think it's grown to 12% conservatives in our group. And we want more. And those conservatives want a solution to climate change. And they like fee and dividend. And we're still working to get some Republican senators and Republican congressmen on this bill. This latest version of the bill is more progressive than the former one because we had a regulatory pause in the original bill in part to appease conservatives, because we felt like if we were putting a fee on carbon emissions, we didn't have to regulate them as well, to like double regulate them, so to speak. So we had a regulatory pause placed on those, and that appealed to conservatives and Republicans, because then they could go back to their constituents and say, hey, I'm supporting this bill, and it's going to reduce regulations. But since we couldn't get any Republicans to co-sponsor this new bill, we took that out. Well, I don't know the exact reasons, but in any case, we took that out. And so now there's no regulatory pause. And what we're going to say to Republicans is say, hey, if you don't like this bill because it doesn't have a regulatory pause, well, get in the game. Put your own bill in there with a regulatory pause. And if you get enough Republicans, maybe that's a compromise we could make to put it back in. But you got to get in the game. And so right now, there's 28 Democratic co-sponsors, and we hope to get over 100 co-sponsors for the Energy Innovation and Carbon Dividend Act.
Great. Mike Albrow has a couple of points. He's just talking about these charts, and the charts always give a model of what you determine and what you anticipate happening, and he's cautioning that we stay realistic, that you can't be completely predictive. He says, surely nothing can be predicted at the 1% level in 2025, given that society is not physics. Of course, 2025 is coming up pretty soon.
Yeah.
We're getting more focused in on exactly what's going to happen. He also says he likes the idea, but the bar charts with no uncertainty shown can be misleading, but maybe they're needed for lobbying purposes and so on too.
Yeah,
I mean, you have to stick, as long as people realize that something is a model.
yeah,
Models have uncertainty.
right.
This is what the model says.
Yeah, that's why, and that Mike makes an excellent point. And so there's a lot of unknown out there. And that's why I mentioned that modelers refuse to make predictions more than 10 years out. And I'm sure that even there's a lot of uncertainty in that. And that's why I was glad I showed that one slide that showed the uncertainty in that particular model with different parameters. But yeah, and you do need to show trends, and you do need to do something that's not too complicated for people to appreciate the message you're trying to get across.
So I believe that you came to the Science Sunday talk about from the Citizens Climate Lobby, and that's what got you engaged. So I feel pretty enthused about that. That's a nice feeling, and I know I spent time with it and haven't been involved with it nearly as much as you. But what I'm asking you is to talk to other people, and how can you reach out to other people and tell them what to do and how to get involved and to support you?
Absolutely. I do presentations periodically, or I talk to my friends, and my friend will say, "Wow, that's interesting, Mark. Keep at it." And you're like, "Yeah, I will, but I would really like you to help me." And the way you can help is you can get involved in an organization that's really working to do something about this. So Citizens Climate Lobby is a great one, but there's other ones as well. If you don't have time to dedicate a lot of time to an organization, there's other things you can do. We have a calling campaign where you only have to, you get an email that reminds you to call once a month, and you call your legislator and you tell them, you know, I want you to do something about climate, and I want you to know that I care about it, and just to give them that incentive to do something. We have writing campaigns and email campaigns that you can join. So you can find all these things by just Googling Citizens Climate Lobby and joining an effort to make a difference. Right now, we have a postcard campaign that we're writing postcards to President Biden. And so you could just fill out a postcard and send it to 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue and say, please include a carbon price in your climate package. And so that's what we're doing right now.
Great, all right. Well, I'd say that I was really impressed with the 19 spikes on there, and just to prove that he wasn't using super glue or anything like that, I think you had this thing set up so that when I just touched this table a slight amount, it proved that these were all individuals working together to make something occur, right?
That's exactly right, Mike. It was all planned.
Yeah. All right. Well, I thought it was wonderful. It was a great talk, very motivating. I feel more enthused than I have in a number of years about what we can do as an individual Spike working towards making the world a better place, and you help bring that out every time I meet and talk with you. So thank you so much for being here today.
Thank you, Mike. A pleasure to be here.
All right, great.